So I'm a political scientist by training, and I study irregular events. And so things that sort of are like black swans or very unusual events that happen, coups and civil wars and political violence. And this led me to ask deeper questions, which is what Fluke is about, all about how little tiny changes can produce massive consequences. And so the book in a nutshell is basically applying chaos theory and some theories from physics and evolutionary biology to human events and to history and to why things happen in the rest of the world. So the formal definition refers to this idea of sensitivity to initial conditions, which basically means that as a system evolves over time, in chaotic systems, small fluctuations can have enormous consequences. And so this is where many people come to this through the butterfly effect, this idea that a butterfly flapping its wings can eventually manifest in a hurricane. And indeed, chaos theory's origins come from weather forecasting. A guy named Edward Norton Lorenz discovered chaos theory when he was doing early modeling of weather systems. But when you think about human events, the story that opens Fluke is one where a couple goes on vacation in 1926 to Kyoto in Japan, and they fall in love with the city. They have a sort of soft spot for it. 19 years later, the husband ends up as America's Secretary of War. His name is Henry Stimson, and he's in charge of deciding where to drop the first atomic bomb. And the target committee picks Kyoto. They agree that Kyoto should be destroyed. Stimson convinces Harry Truman, the US president, not to do that, partly because he had vacation there 19 years earlier. And that is chaos theory in human affairs. It's a vacation happens in 1926. Suddenly, 100,000 people live or die in Kyoto versus Hiroshima. And the second bomb was supposed to go to a place called Kokura, but it didn't get dropped there because of a passing cloud that obscured the bomb site. And so the second bomb went to Nagasaki. So if you think about these principles in science, these sort of chaotic dynamics and systems can also apply to how human history can be swayed for hundreds of thousands of people and the trajectory of the 20th century from a 19-year-old vacation and a passing cloud.
You see that if you look towards more, if you had like the computing power to look at a lot of historic events that happened, you'd find some random events that somehow led to them.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that when you think about modeling, we are often told what I think is a very unhelpful bit of advice, which is to separate the signal from the noise and try to find, the X that causes Y. The problem is that the way that the world actually works is that everything has an infinite number of causes or a near infinite number of causes. So if you think about, World War II, this stretches back to geography, geology, the deposits of uranium around the atomic bomb. Who was born and who wasn't born. I mean, all these things have massive ripple effects that manifest themselves in human events. So what modeling tries to do, because it's the only way to sort of cram an infinitely complex world into a computer model, is to radically simplify it. And I think one of the things that I try to argue in the book is that we've focused so much on trying to model a world that's more useful, tameable, and controllable in modeling that we've forgotten what's actually true, which is that you cannot model complex reality with 6 or 7 variables and a straight line of X causing Y. And so the interconnected nature of the universe and the world means that you cannot discount the noise, because the noise ultimately does eventually matter, even if it's not discernible in the short time scales that we often consider in modeling.
So zooming in into individual lives, presumably this sort of event happens, like for instance, if I snooze my alarm 5 more minutes, that could have a ripple effect. And everyone likes to think they're in control, but how much of our life is actually random?
Yeah, so I have this phrase I call the snooze button effect, which basically says that, if you imagine hitting the snooze button when you wake up today, or you rewind the clock by 5 seconds and you don't hit the snooze button, I think it's a discernible fact that your life will forever be different. And I think that's because the ripple effects of that snooze button choice will cause you to have different conversations with different people, possibly to have different interactions with different people, and those will manifest over time. I mean, when we think about the long tentacles of how we end up in jobs or meeting our spouses and so on, often everything has to be exactly as it was for that outcome to be the eventual fate of your life and so on. Now, this has philosophical implications because I think all of us want to imagine, and also our evolved cognition fixates us on this idea of controlling our destiny. And I think it's impossible to do that. I think it's literally uncontrollable, the world that we inhabit. And so what we do is we try to have shortcuts that give us the illusion of control. And particularly that's very seductive right now because our daily lives have never been more controllable than they are today, where you have sort of, the Google Maps strategy of understanding how long it's going to take you to get somewhere. You have, you can order something on Amazon and know when it will arrive and so on. But at the same time, the superstructure of our world is changing more than ever before and faster than ever before. So hundreds of thousands of years of evolved cognition, most Homo sapiens lived in roughly the same sort of hunter-gatherer world that their ancestors did. Now our world is changing every few years. I mean, AI didn't really exist in any big way a couple of years ago. And as a result of that, we have this bizarre aspect where we feel more in control of our daily lives than has ever been true in human history, at the same time that the overall structure of the world is changing at an unprecedented pace. And I think that's why so many people feel disoriented in 2024 as they try to navigate the world, grapple with complexity, and try to assert control in what I think is fundamentally an uncontrollable universe.
So armed with this knowledge that we're not actually in control and we're all, swimming in randomness, how can we make sort of better decisions in our day-to-day life?
Yeah, so I think if you take the view that you live in a controllable world where you understand everything, then you should optimize to the absolute limits and not experiment. And given that I don't think that world exists, I think we should take the opposite ideas. We should be building much more towards resilience and doing much more experimentation. So when it comes to resilience, if you have a world that is swayed by flukes where small things can make a big difference, and you have something where, a single mutation of a virus can cause a pandemic for 2 years, or you can have a vacation that I talked about previously cause, one city to be destroyed and another one to be saved. In that world, a world of resilience is a much bigger priority. Now, our social worlds deprioritize this. I mean, if you think about elections, if you think about quarterly profits, everything is around optimization. And life hacks and strategies for living are around eliminating inefficiency. But sometimes inefficiency provides slack in systems. So my argument is that in highly uncertain contexts, which is the modern world, you should have basically some slack and some resilience as a matter of planning. And I think we're drifting away from that at a time in which we need it the most, right? We're embedding systemic risk into systems at the same time that we are fetishizing and fixating on optimization to the absolute limit. And this is why, if you think about the Suez Canal being blocked a couple of years ago, it caused $50 billion of damage because that system had no slack. You have one boat block the canal, and all of a sudden the global economy has these ripple effects. The second lesson is experimentation, which is a lesson that every species has learned, and is how evolution works as well, which is that as an environment is changing, experimentation is the smartest way to navigate it. And because we live in a non-fixed environment, I think it's extremely important that we dial up experimentation. Now, most of what we are told is not to do that. I mean, I think that when you think about the Google Maps approach to life, it's to follow a sort of optimal route at all times, right? And I think there's some evidence that forced experimentation is actually very good for us. So one example I cite in the book is there was a tube strike in London where the subway was shut down. And ultimately the result of this was that 5% of the London population stuck with the new way that they went to work during the tube strike. They were forced to try something different and they found something better. And I think a lot of what our life is supposed to be in the way that, sort of self-help and other gurus tell us is you just sort of find the optimal pathway. That only makes sense if the world is static, unchanging, and fully understood. And I think none of those conditions apply to 21st century complexity of modern society.
That's super interesting. Here in the UK, supermarkets were super optimized during the pandemic.
Yep.
They had no stock, and so they had major shortages during the pandemic. So to build a bit more on that, do you think we should prepare for multiple possible universes, right? Prepare for a universe in which there's a new pandemic and so on? That's the approach we should have in general?
Yeah, I think basically if you think the world is uncertain, then you should have resilience as a watchword that drives systemic thinking. And I think the great challenge, and this is something that I think is really difficult, is that the supermarkets that would have been prepared for the pandemic would have had slightly lower profits because they wouldn't have been optimized. Now, okay, in a supermarket context, that manifests as shortages and so on. But think about how that applies to politics. I mean, we have learned no lessons of the pandemic. There has been no efforts to try to create more resilient systems in politics. And all of the reward structures when it comes to democratic processes, for example, are that if you do long-term planning, it is highly likely that your successor from the rival party will benefit from it because they'll be in power at the point where it pays off. So, anyone who would have invested in, for example, personal protective equipment, let's say in 2016, might not have been in power when the pandemic struck in 2020. And so, this is the great challenge, I think, for us as a society, is to actually give politicians, business leaders, those who are powerful in our societies, rewards when they plan for eventual catastrophes. And it's very difficult to do that in a system where, if you don't deliver short-term payoffs, you're fired, or you lose your job, or you get replaced as a CEO, or you don't get elected again. So, I think that's something that we have to grapple with as a society, is thinking, if we live in a much more uncertain place than we used to, which I think is true, then in that world, we really need to have a prioritization and a reward structure that says plan for eventualities. And the obvious lesson that I always say to people is think about what the 21st century has been. It's been a series of calamities. It has been 9/11, the Iraq War, the financial meltdown and the financial crisis, the Arab Spring, which was sparked by one man lighting himself on fire in central Tunisia. You have the election of Trump, Brexit, the pandemic, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. I mean, none of these were forecast. And so the things that determine how our lives unfold are very often black swan events. And the lesson we fail to learn every time is, why didn't we plan for anything, right? Why didn't we have a rainy day fund? Why didn't we have a sort of resilience as a priority for our societies? And I think that is something that I hope this book galvanizes, not just for thinking about the scientific underlying principles of complex reality, but also how do you deal with it? And I think the lessons have not been learned.
Sorry about that. That was unplanned.
Yeah.
So how exactly do we do this? Because our political system is built in 4-year cycles or something like that. Financials work in 1 year or sometimes even less.
Yep.
How do we do that practically? How do we find solutions to this?
Well, I think there's two things we have to do. One is that we have to have a mentality shift as a society. I mean, I think that there's got to be a debate, sort of an adult debate about the trade-offs of these things, where we talk about how sometimes it is a very good idea to have a little bit of resilience and inefficiency in society designed, right? So that there are sort of extra layers if something goes wrong. And one of the examples I talk about in the book is a classic case from a Latin American country where they had a power grid that they had designed, and one version of the power grid was optimized to the limit. It had no regional hubs that could sort of make it less efficient and so on. But it meant that in that version, it was going to be way cheaper, but if disaster struck anywhere, the entire country's power grid would be taken down. What they ultimately did was a more expensive, less efficient model where they had regional hubs and nodes, and then eventually when there was a blackout in one of them, it was contained. And that's that's the analogy of what I'm talking about, right? It's the stuff where the short-term benefits may not be perfect, but the long-term benefits more than pay for that cost. And so, I think we have to have, as voters, as people who are investors in businesses, we have to think beyond the quarterly profits of the next election. That's going to take time, but I think that someone has to say to us, look, all the stuff that's gone wrong in the 21st century has been stuff where we didn't plan for it. And, I think that's something where we would be much better off with steady but slightly lower growth rather than shocks constantly and these sort of sugar highs of seemingly optimized, seemingly perfectly efficient systems until everything collapses and we all deal with the consequences collectively.
And lastly, a sort of personal or philosophical question. Do you find chaos empowering?
Yes. So first, when people come to this idea, I think there's a temptation to become nihilistic and the idea that nothing matters, right? And the third part of the subtitle of my book is why everything we do matters. I believe that to my absolute core, and it's an interesting juxtaposition because I don't believe in free will. I have a chapter where I talk about why I don't believe in free will as a scientific principle, and that can lead people to feel deep despair. I think the flip side of that is that if you live in an interconnected world in which the smallest change can produce long-term ripple effects, affect the trajectory of the future of the universe, then literally everything we are doing at any moment is important. There's no throwaway moments in our lives. So if the snooze button effect is real, if every choice that we make reshapes the world, the trajectory of our lives and of others every second, then there is no meaningless part of existence. And I think, to me, that is one of the most uplifting antidotes to the modern malaise that a lot of people feel, because most people who are feeling anxiety, depression, and a sort of existential angst in 21st century life are feeling interchangeable. They're feeling like nothing they do matters. Like they're part of this, this tiny cog in this giant machine where you know that if you die, your corporation will just replace you the next week. And that feeling makes people, I think, feel really powerless. I say, no, it's actually that you have a tremendous, tremendous power by virtue of existing to reshape the trajectory of the world we live in and the universe we inhabit. And all of that is constantly happening, every conversation, every action, etc. And to me, that's enough. It's not that there's a broader cosmic purpose to life. It's not that I have immense control or that I have perfect agency. It's that what I do is important. And I think that's something that all of us can sort of flip that lie that we've been told, that a happy life is a life of control, and instead understand that we may control nothing, but we influence everything. And that's, to me, a much nicer way to think about the world, as well as being, in my view, scientifically accurate.